In the early months of 1930, across vast stretches of rural China, the rhythm of life began to falter. Rivers swelled beyond their banks in some regions, while in others the land hardened under relentless drought. Harvests that sustained entire provinces failed in silence. Grain stores emptied, markets thinned, and the fragile balance that supported millions of rural families began to collapse. What began as a series of environmental shocks would grow into one of the most devastating food crises of the early 20th century, unfolding across a nation already strained by political instability, fragile infrastructure, and deep rural poverty. To understand how this disaster unfolded, it is necessary to look at the conditions that shaped China at the start of the 1930s. The country was still recovering from decades of upheaval. The Qing dynasty had fallen less than 2 decades earlier, leaving behind a fractured political landscape. Power in many regions remained divided among warlords, local authorities, and a central government struggling to consolidate control. Rural China, where the vast majority of the population lived, depended almost entirely on small-scale agriculture. Families cultivated modest plots of land using traditional tools and techniques that had changed little for generations. Agriculture in China had always been closely tied to the seasonal patterns of rivers and monsoon rains. For centuries, farmers had adapted to periodic floods and dry spells, but the early 20th century brought environmental extremes that strained these traditional systems. Population growth had intensified pressure on farmland. In many areas, fields extended onto floodplains that had once served as natural buffers during heavy rains. Protective infrastructure such as levees and canals existed in some regions, but many had deteriorated after years of conflict and limited maintenance. In 1930, a sequence of unusual weather patterns began to reshape the landscape. Parts of northern China experienced prolonged drought. The soil hardened and cracked, making it difficult to plant crops. Wells ran low, and irrigation channels dried. Farmers watched as wheat and millet struggled to grow under the relentless sun. Livestock weakened from lack of forage, and rural households faced mounting uncertainty about the coming harvest. At the same time, other regions experienced the opposite extreme. Heavy seasonal rains fed the great river systems that crossed central China, including the Yangtze and the Huai. Water levels rose steadily, placing strain on levees and flood control systems that had already been weakened by years of neglect. Communities along riverbanks were familiar with seasonal flooding, but the scale of the rising waters in 1930 began to exceed expectations. The combination of drought in some regions and flooding in others created a complex national crisis. China's agricultural system depended on the movement of grain from surplus regions to those facing shortages. Transportation networks, however, were limited. Railways connected some major cities, but large portions of the countryside relied on river transport or primitive roadways that became impassable during severe weather. As harvests failed in drought-affected regions, local grain supplies diminished rapidly. Rural households often depended on small reserves stored after previous harvests. These reserves rarely lasted long when crops failed for consecutive seasons. As food became scarce, families attempted to purchase grain in local markets, but supply shortages drove prices upward. Flooding in central China compounded the crisis. Rising waters submerged fields before crops could be harvested. Villages along riverbanks faced evacuation as floodwaters spread across the countryside. When farmland remained underwater for extended periods, the agricultural cycle was disrupted for months or even years. Silt deposits sometimes enriched soil in the long term, but the immediate consequence was the destruction of crops that communities relied upon for survival. By late 1930, signs of widespread food shortages began to emerge across multiple provinces. Rural families reduced meals and relied on whatever food could still be gathered locally. In many areas, the collapse of agricultural production also meant the loss of income. Farmers who normally sold surplus grain had nothing to trade, and rural laborers found fewer opportunities for work. China's political situation complicated the response to the growing crisis. The nationalist government, based in Nanjing, was attempting to extend administrative control over a vast and diverse country. Local authorities played a major role in responding to emergencies, but their resources varied widely. Some regions organized relief efforts through local associations or charitable groups. Others struggled to coordinate assistance due to limited funding or political divisions. International awareness of China's food shortages gradually increased. Foreign missionaries, journalists, and relief organizations operating in various parts of the country reported worsening conditions in rural areas. These reports described villages facing dwindling food supplies and rising malnutrition. Relief agencies began to mobilize resources, but the scale of the crisis made assistance difficult to distribute quickly. Transportation limitations remained a major obstacle. Delivering grain to remote communities required coordination across fragmented infrastructure networks. Flooded waterways could disrupt river transport, while drought conditions in other areas made travel difficult along rural roads. In many regions, relief shipments arrived slowly compared with the pace at which food shortages were spreading. The human consequences unfolded unevenly across the landscape. Some communities experienced moderate shortages that strained households but remained manageable through local support networks. In other areas, particularly where both environmental damage and economic disruption were severe, the impact was far more serious. Malnutrition weakened populations already living close to subsistence levels. Public health conditions also deteriorated in some regions. Flooding often contaminated water supplies, increasing the risk of disease outbreaks. Medical services in rural China were limited, and health systems struggled to address growing needs during the crisis. Although humanitarian organizations attempted to distribute medicine and food, their capacity was limited compared with the scale of the population affected. As the crisis continued into the early 1930s, it became increasingly clear that the food shortages were part of a broader environmental disaster. The following year, 1931, would bring catastrophic flooding along major rivers, further damaging crops and displacing large populations. The events that began in 1930 were therefore not an isolated incident but the beginning of a prolonged period of environmental instability that affected millions of people across central and northern China. Economic consequences also rippled through the national economy. Agricultural production formed the backbone of China's economic system. When harvests failed, rural purchasing power declined sharply. Local markets contracted, and merchants who depended on agricultural trade faced financial losses. Grain price fluctuations added further instability, with shortages driving prices upward in some areas while transportation barriers prevented grain from reaching regions where it was most needed. Government officials and relief organizations recognized the importance of rebuilding flood control systems and improving agricultural resilience. Plans were discussed to strengthen levees, expand irrigation networks, and improve transportation routes for distributing grain. However, implementing large-scale infrastructure improvements required financial resources and political stability that remained difficult to secure during this period. The international community also played a role in relief efforts. Several humanitarian organizations raised funds to support famine relief programs in China. Shipments of grain, clothing, and medical supplies were organized through cooperative networks involving foreign missions, Chinese charitable associations, and government agencies. These efforts provided assistance to many communities, though they could not fully offset the widespread agricultural losses. Within rural society, communities relied heavily on traditional coping strategies. Families pooled resources with relatives or neighbors when possible. Some households migrated temporarily in search of work or food supplies. Local temples, charitable societies, and village organizations sometimes organized communal kitchens or grain distribution efforts to support those most in need. Despite these efforts, the combined effects of drought, flooding, and economic disruption created long-term challenges for many rural families. Agricultural recovery required stable weather conditions and access to seeds, livestock, and tools, resources that were often depleted during the crisis. Rebuilding rural livelihoods took years, particularly in regions where repeated environmental shocks continued to affect crop production. The events of 1930 also revealed deeper structural vulnerabilities in China's agricultural system. Heavy dependence on seasonal rainfall, limited irrigation infrastructure, and fragmented transportation networks made it difficult to manage large-scale food shortages. In addition, political fragmentation and limited administrative coordination complicated national responses to natural disasters. These vulnerabilities would remain a central concern for policymakers in the decades that followed. Later governments placed greater emphasis on flood control, irrigation expansion, and agricultural modernization in an effort to reduce the risk of similar crises. Large-scale infrastructure projects along major rivers eventually became part of broader strategies to stabilize food production and protect farmland from environmental extremes. For the millions of rural families who lived through the early 1930s famine conditions, however, the experience was immediate and deeply personal. Crops lost to drought or flood meant more than economic hardship, they threatened the stability of entire communities built around the agricultural calendar. Fields that had supported generations suddenly produced little or nothing, and the consequences rippled outward through every aspect of rural life. Historical records from the period emphasize how closely the disaster was tied to environmental forces interacting with social conditions. Neither drought nor flooding alone fully explains the scale of the crisis. Instead, it was the combination of extreme weather, fragile infrastructure, political fragmentation, and widespread rural poverty that allowed local food shortages to grow into a national emergency. Looking back, the famine conditions that began in 1930 stand as an example of how environmental events can intersect with human systems in complex ways. Natural disasters do not occur in isolation, their impact depends heavily on the resilience of the societies they affect. In early 20th century China, that resilience was limited by economic hardship.